Berlin, July the 6th, 1940. Eva Braun took these pictures from a window in the Reich Chancellery. As always on official occasions, Hitler's mistress had to remain in the background. Adolf Hitler was returning to the Chancellery from France as a glorious commander. People had been waiting for the dictator for 6 hours. In his diary, Joseph Goebbels wrote,
"The cheering from the jubilant masses is indescribable. The Führer is being welcomed with a carpet of flowers. Our people, our wonderful people."
The New York Times reported,
"The streets were full of thousands of cheering people. Shouting and weeping, they worked themselves up into a truly hysterical frenzy."
In the summer of 1940, following the successful Blitzkrieg campaigns in Poland, France and Norway, for a while peace and calm returned to the capital of the German Reich. On July the 16th, Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels noted in his diary,
"In politics and in the conduct of the war, there is an absolute lull."
The war seemed far off and people went swimming. Just like every year, Berliners headed for the Wannsee Lake. Hitler had promised his people that the Nazi Reich would last 1,000 years, and in the summer of 1940, it looked as if the dictator might be right.
In April 1941, Hitler opened up a new theatre of war. The military intervention in Greece by his Italian allies threatened to end in disaster. Consequently, the Wehrmacht marched first of all into Yugoslavia and then into Greece. Gottfried Kessel, an officer with the Großdeutschland Infantry Regiment, was a keen cine photographer, so his company had chosen him to keep a film diary of its operations. After 11 days, the Yugoslav army surrendered unconditionally. Germany took some 350,000 prisoners. These pictures show Serb soldiers being held in Belgrade Fortress.
Those taken prisoner also included Serb civilians who were suspected of being partisans. Partisan raids took place time and again. In the night of April the 21st, near the cemetery in the village of Pančevo, one SS soldier was shot dead and another seriously wounded. As a result, Wehrmacht troops and members of the SS Das Reich Division carried out arbitrary house searches. Civilians of military age were arrested at random.
The occupying forces took terrible revenge for the attack. The next day, Gottfried Kessel filmed the execution of alleged partisans in Pančevo. In a staged trial, those accused of guerrilla activity had no chance to defend themselves. As a deterrent, 17 men and 1 woman were hanged in public. The gruesome task was performed by an ethnic German executioner. Then 12 former Serbian soldiers were lined up on the cemetery wall in Pančevo and executed by firing squad. Gottfried Kessel also filmed this brutal act for his war diary. This scene, where a German soldier gives the coup de grâce to one of the men, became one of the most abhorrent symbols of German crimes committed during the Second World War.
On August the 28th, 1941, Adolf Hitler met with Italian dictator Benito Mussolini. The Duce had come especially to witness the successful progress of the campaign against the Soviet Union, one in which Italian troops were also involved. 2 months previously, despite the existence of a non-aggression pact, Nazi Germany had attacked Russia. The Red Army, it seems, was ill prepared for the invasion because Joseph Stalin had ignored all warnings right to the very end. In less than a week, German troops had swept through that part of Poland annexed by the Soviet Union and advanced into the Ukraine. Lunchtime for high-ranking officers and their adjutants. This colour footage was taken by Hans Bauer, a keen amateur photographer who had been Hitler's chief pilot ever since 1933. His position enabled him to take pictures even in the immediate vicinity of the dictator without any restrictions. On a flight to the front, Bauer took the opportunity to film Mussolini from close up because the Duce liked to sit in the cockpit. Later, Bauer remembered,
"I took 6 meters of film, but Mussolini sat there like a stuffed dummy. Stiff as a board, with his head held high, he didn't move a muscle. All I got were pictures with no life to them. With his chin jutting out, Mussolini had this wild look in his eyes, but he never moved."
Hitler and Mussolini had flown to Uman on a troop visit. The men gave the Führer an overwhelming reception. During their advance, many of them had been involved in crimes against the civilian population. Also present in Uman was Hitler's personal cameraman. Walter Frenz was filming the staged scene officially for the Wochenschau weekly newsreel, but in black and white.
In a battle of encirclement which had lasted from July the 15th to August the 8th, the dictator's troops had defeated 20 divisions of the Red Army and paved the way for an advance into the Donbas region and the hinterland of the Ukraine. 100,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoner.
As Hitler and his entourage were returning to their aircraft, the injured troops who had been brought in as a backdrop were driven back to their field hospitals. Some of the men had had terrible experiences. In a state of despair, Corporal Alois Scheuer wrote,
"We now know the full tragedy of war. It's the greatest disaster to befall mankind. It brutalizes people. Only my faith stops me from becoming almost apathetic, mentally and spiritually."
That was of no interest to either the high-ranking officers or the Nazi bigwigs accompanying the two dictators. Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop and Hitler's private secretary Martin Bormann were particularly compliant aides to the Führer, who is said to have told a small circle of associates that
Basically, the war in the East has already been won. Moscow will be razed to the ground.
However, within a few months, the war had become a nightmare for his troops. Yet it wasn't Stalin's armies that had brought the German advance to a halt, but rain and cold.
The Obersalzberg, early June 1942. Hitler was relaxing in the mountains for a few days. The campaign against the Red Army had become bogged down outside Moscow and Leningrad in the mud and snow of winter. Now, a major offensive was to give fresh momentum to the Führer's faltering blitzkrieg. Hitler's guest at the Berghof on this occasion was Sepp Dietrich. The head of the SS Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler was one of the Führer's old comrades from the early days of the Nazi movement. After Hitler seized power, this unquestioningly loyal warhorse had murders carried out time and again on behalf of his master. To mark Dietrich's birthday, the Führer made him a personal gift of 100,000 Reichsmarks and appointed him Colonel General of the Waffen-SS.
This footage stems from Eva Braun's estate. Sepp Dietrich is joking around with Eva's sister Gretel, who was part of Hitler's court. Dietrich with the children of Hitler's favorite architect, Albert Speer. Dietrich was allowed to accompany the Führer on his daily walk up to a peak called the Mooslaner Kopf. Dietrich's troops had already burned villages on the campaigns in Poland and France and committed numerous crimes against the civilian population. On Hitler's orders, they had also been involved in the systematic murder of Polish Jews. The Waffen-SS had carried out further massacres in the Ukraine and in Russia. Before the war against the Soviet Union, the commander-in-chief had told his generals of his true intentions.
It will be a war of annihilation. Our military leaders must make the personal sacrifice of overcoming their misgivings.
Around roughly the same time, a cameraman with the army's propaganda unit was filming the Wehrmacht's advance in the Soviet Union. Hans Bastanier and his team had 35mm colour film at their disposal. The 31-year-old convinced Nazi had been chosen to produce a spectacular film using the newly developed material. The propaganda ministry wanted to see heroes, and Bastanier provided the requisite pictures. In discussions with his associates in 1941, Hitler had already talked through plans for the future face of Eastern Europe. The goal, he said, was to conquer vast areas to ensure the racial survival of the Germans.
The law of natural selection justifies this eternal battle because it makes the survival of the fittest possible. It's absurd that a higher-ranking people should struggle to exist on land that is too restricted, while amorphous masses who contribute nothing to civilization occupy endless areas of terrain which is among the richest in the world. The Crimea and the Ukraine will become a totally German colony, and the previous inhabitants will be displaced. "30 million people in the East were to fall victim to Hitler's monstrous plans. As Nazi ideologists saw it, communists, Jews, and members of a wide range of Slavic tribes would have to make way for the master race. Within a few months, SS special task forces operating behind the front had murdered hundreds of thousands of Jews. Linz in Upper Austria. On April the 20th, 1942, the whole town was dressed up and taking part in processions to celebrate the Führer's birthday. The formations included the Hitler Youth and the Federation of German Girls. Linz proudly carried the title of the Führer's adoptive city because this is where Hitler spent most of his youth. After final victory had been achieved, he planned to spend his twilight years in Linz. Colossal buildings had long since been planned for construction. At this point in time, Ruth Andreas Friedrich, a journalist who was critical of the regime, was hoping that more and more Germans would turn their back on the regime. In summer 1942, she wrote in her diary,
"The age of the individual is over. The strong are no longer at their most powerful when they are on their own. We must form a shock troop right across Berlin. Our people must be in position in every district. Sworn Confederates who can be trusted implicitly. Old circles of friends are no longer adequate, and not all of them are suitable. New people need to be found from every camp. Each individual must bring his or her clique into play with all their connections and possibilities. What one person lacks, the other will provide. It's now about distributing roles, yet without getting caught by the Gestapo."
In Linz, party bigwigs paid homage to the dictator. The dignitaries of the Nazi Reich were still fully behind their Führer, and most of them would give him fanatical support right to the end.
On May the 12th, 1942, the Red Army launched a major offensive on a broad front. The aim was to retake Kharkov. Hans Bastanier was sitting with his camera in a German tank, filming the battle. To the northeast of the city, a Wehrmacht tank unit had been given the task of repulsing units of the Soviet 28th Army. The propaganda ministry planned to use the footage in The Front in Colour, a monthly newsreel which would only be shown in cinemas in neutral foreign countries. Stalin's forces sustained heavy losses and failed to achieve their goal of breaking through the defensive ring in front of Kharkov.
But the Wehrmacht's counter-offensive was successful. On May the 22nd, 1942, the Soviet armies were encircled and the Germans took around 240,000 prisoners. Pictures from the center of Kharkov.
Hans Bastanier was a specialist in colour photography, and he succeeded in attaining the required quality standards. But the planned monthly newsreel never materialised. Only a few scenes on his film were used in German weekly newsreels, in black and white.
The German troops stationed in Kharkov were to lack nothing. Entertainment films were provided to make them forget the horrors of war for a few hours. In the soldiers' hostels, the troops' needs were seen to. It wasn't until August 1943 that the Red Army was finally able to liberate Kharkov. The cameraman also filmed these motorcycle riflemen with the 3rd Armored Reconnaissance Unit. At the time, Ruth Andreas Friedrich noted,
"The Germans are still victorious in Russia. People still talk of Stalin now throwing his final reserves into battle against us. But Moscow today lies many kilometers behind the Russian front. And even though every week sees a few dozen readers' letters arriving at the publishing house, sent by enthusiastic final victory apostles wanting information on settlement opportunities in the Crimea and the Caucasus, the last word still hasn't been spoken about the Caucasus either. The war can still be lost even beyond the Elbrus."
On August the 21st, 1942, mountain troops from Bavaria had indeed scaled the highest peak in the Caucasus and planted the imperial war flag on Mount Elbrus. But the poor weather ruled out any photographs or film footage of the event. So in early September, the Armed Forces High Command sent experienced climber and cameraman Hans Ertl into the mountain range to restage the heroic deed in bright sunshine.
Ertl took the opportunity to film German mountain troops driving out Red Army forces who had occupied an important pass. As a former cameraman with Leni Riefenstahl, he was an adept filmmaker. The film Ertl completed in June 1943 was entitled Alarm on the Pass. For many years it was thought to have been lost. It was only in the late 90s that a copy turned up in Russia.
On March the 18th, 1943, a documentary appeared in cinemas in America which showed the advance of Allied troops in North Africa. The director was none other than Hollywood supremo John Ford. After his award-winning films on the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and the battle for Midway Island in the Pacific, the Oscar-winning director also wanted to present the war against the Nazis in color.
On November the 8th, 1942, British and American troops landed in Morocco and Algeria. A short time later, 40 camera teams unloaded their equipment. The expedition was headed by Hollywood mogul Darryl F. Zanuck, one of the founders of 20th Century Fox. The film contained expressive footage, but one US critic later complained that
At the front in North Africa clearly bears Zanuck's signature, artistic shots of tank trucks, sunrise and sunsets, and no end of superfluous frills.
Behind the front, a camera team witnessed an attack by German aircraft and took dramatic pictures. Director John Ford was in his element. He had already recorded similarly spectacular footage in his film The Battle of Midway. But for his employers at the War Department, this wasn't enough. The problem was that the scenes were totally authentic and thus inadequate for the military authorities. The British enjoyed great success with their Desert Victory production, but many of the dramatic scenes in it had been quickly restaged. When Secretary of War Henry Stimson saw At the Front in North Africa, he found the film feeble and not very inspiring. In his diary he wrote,
We have only just realized the importance of such efforts. Our cameramen obviously have no desire to get killed. The British have lost 4 cameramen and many more have been wounded. We must be willing to take a more energetic approach and thus do a better job.
Scenes which the team filmed in their spare time, far from the front, came in for particular criticism. Here the soldiers have got hold of a turkey, because in America on November the 26th, 1942, people were celebrating Thanksgiving. Then the director himself appears in the picture, John Ford sitting astride a donkey. In early December, when German and Allied armoured units clashed not far from Tunis, Ford's camera teams were present. Hitler had ordered the new Tiger tanks to be sent not to the Eastern Front, but to North Africa, where they inflicted a bitter defeat on the advancing British and Americans. A cameraman had entrenched himself on a nearby hill and took authentic pictures, but they also met with disappointment back in the United States. Shortly before the premiere, Darryl Zanuck admitted,
I'm afraid that our war scenes don't look as dangerous and realistic as the battle scenes we film at our studios. You simply can't have everything.
For these captured German and Italian troops, the war is over, but not for their comrades. They're not so lucky. In the end, even the Tiger tanks could not prevent an Allied victory in the desert. Hitler refused to allow his remaining troops in North Africa to withdraw. But in May 1943, they finally surrendered.
Casablanca, mid-January 1943. In the elegant suburb of Anfa, a hotel and several comfortably appointed villas have been cleared to accommodate delegations from Washington and London. On January 14th, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill travelled to Morocco with its top brass to attend a secret conference with the President of the United States. The British wanted to land on Sardinia or Sicily as soon as possible in order to attack the Third Reich from the south.
US President Franklin D. Roosevelt arrived in Casablanca exhausted from the 5-day Atlantic crossing. Since the age of 39, when he contracted poliomyelitis, the 60-year-old had been confined to a wheelchair. Since he avoided any pictures that showed his handicap, the president sat in a jeep as the American Guard of Honor marched past. A cameraman with the Signal Corps took these pictures of Roosevelt's trip to the Casablanca conference with 35mm color film for the president's own personal archive. They were not published until many years later. German propaganda had got wind of the meeting between the two statesmen, but Joseph Goebbels assumed that Churchill had travelled to Washington. In his diary, he wrote,
"In our currently difficult situation, Churchill and Roosevelt will, of course, try to step forward with a demonstrative political statement designed to undermine our nation's morale. But I will do everything in my power to shield our people from such machinations."
Naturally, the US president and his generals knew that the Wehrmacht was facing a devastating defeat on the Eastern Front, because at Stalingrad, the Sixth Army had been encircled. The Americans were still clinging to the hope that an invasion could be launched across the English Channel in 1943, but they didn't have the requisite troop strengths or the necessary equipment. For days, the Nazi leadership remained in the dark. Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary,
"The meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, which is now indisputable, is creating a stir. At the moment, we don't know where the two super gangsters met. But the press in both Britain and America has announced that sensational news of far-reaching importance will be forthcoming."
The Allies negotiated for 10 days. Roosevelt and Churchill then astonished the world public by stating that Nazi Germany and Japan had to surrender unconditionally. Italy was not mentioned in the press statement, so as not to undermine the possibility of a coup against Mussolini. The Casablanca Conference marked the zenith of Britain's influence on Allied strategy. From now on, the Americans would push their plans through more and more, in close alliance with Moscow. Joseph Stalin was not particularly impressed by the news from Anfa. The Soviet leader had been invited, but, with reference to the battle for Stalingrad, he had decided not to attend the conference.
In January 1943, cameraman Walter Frenz filmed a meeting of two of the Axis powers. The Führer had received Romanian dictator Ion Antonescu at the Wolf's Lair, his headquarters in East Prussia. Hitler was making the Romanians responsible for the precarious situation of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. Antonescu countered by criticizing the Wehrmacht and its commanders. On Hitler's orders, the German people had not been told that the Sixth Army had been encircled for several weeks and stood no chance of receiving help from outside. The Führer categorically rejected any idea of capitulation. Nevertheless, on January 31st, Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus surrendered to the Red Army. The end of Nazi domination of virtually the whole of Europe was now only a question of time.
In the Balkans, partisan units in particular were making life difficult for the Germans. In August 1943, the Yugoslav resistance leader Josip Broz, who was known as Tito, received an Anglo-American military delegation at his mountain hideout. The scene was documented by a cameraman with the US Secret Service, OSS. Tito was a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, in which he had proved his qualities as an organizer of the Communist International. He firmly believed that communists worldwide had to help their comrades in the Soviet Union. Tito's partisans accepted defeats and brutal reprisals by the Germans, and were also fighting against Croatian pro-Nazi collaborators. The British and the Americans had learned from decoded German radio messages that Tito's partisans would mount attacks no matter what the risk. So from then on, the Allies supported them with food and arms, and in doing so, turned a motley group of fighters into a powerful army.
Many Americans in particular held the naive view that communist resistance fighters just had to love freedom. Press reports time and again spoke of self-determination, the right of all nations to choose their own government, which Roosevelt and Churchill had guaranteed in the Atlantic Charter they proclaimed in 1941. The British Prime Minister was called an imperialist because he warned that after the Nazis had been defeated, communist parties would brutally crush all democratically minded forces in Stalin's name. And that's precisely what also happened in Yugoslavia under Tito's rule right through to 1980. At the conference in Casablanca, Churchill and Roosevelt also agreed to step up their air raids on German cities. Henceforth, the British flew at night and the Americans by day. Under the command of Air Marshal Arthur Harris, even residential areas were exposed to morale bombing, as the British called it. But the US Air Force restricted its attacks to targets of military importance, such as submarine pens, armament factories, and German infrastructure. Hollywood director William Wyler was commissioned to document these dangerous operations. He was determined to fly on some of the missions himself and take pictures. On February the 26th, 1943, Wyler and his team filmed the crews of the 91st Bomb Group being informed at daybreak that their next target would be the naval base at Wilhelmshaven. The Americans were stationed at Bassingbourn Airfield near Cambridge. They had to cross the channel 25 times before they were allowed to go back home. Accordingly, Wyler's film was to be entitled 25 Missions.
The girlfriend of US pilot Robert Morgan had christened his bomber the Memphis Belle. Later, the B-17 Flying Fortress lent its name to one of the most successful films on the Second World War. In a radio interview, William Wyler was asked how he had experienced the operations over France and Germany.
Fear. Simple, honest fear. You're afraid of being killed. It's a feeling you've never had until you've been shot at. But there's an even more powerful feeling that really helps. When you look around and see the sky full of flying fortresses, and then look down at the enemy coastline, you'd rather be where you are than down below.
Wyler and the cameramen on board other aircraft had to work under the most difficult conditions. Above all, they had a real problem with the bitter cold at an altitude of more than 10,000 meters.
If you wanted to change the film, you had to take off your glove. But if you took it off for more than 1 or 2 minutes, you would lose some fingers from frostbite. Being on oxygen, your efficiency was at a minimum. Taking 3 steps was like walking a mile.
So far, there was no sign of enemy fighters, but then came the flak. William Wyler.
The flak was terrific. We'd fly through entire belts of it. The blue sky looked like a punctured sieve.
One of the cameramen was killed when his plane was brought down. In a letter, Wyler wrote,
I saw so many who never came back, but it makes a difference when it's one of my own people, someone I recruited myself and sent off on a mission.
William Wyler filmed spectacular scenes of German fighters attacking the bombers. Finally, the big moment. The bomb aimer focuses on his target. Wilhelmshaven is now defenseless.
Later, Wyler constructed his picture as if these scenes had been filmed from the Memphis Belle. But on this particular day, in fact, the B-17 wasn't even in the air.
In the night of the 27th and 28th of July 1943, the British Royal Air Force attacked Hamburg. The bombs created a horrific firestorm, which raged for 5 hours in the workers' suburbs in the east of the city. The next day, fireman Hans Brunswick took these pictures of the firefighting operations. 24 hours after the raid, some of the fires were still burning. Around 150,000 people were left homeless. Hamburg author Hans-Erich Nossack wrote,
"Nothing around us bore any resemblance to what we had lost. It was something totally different, something alien, something that could not actually be possible. But why document all this? Would it not be better for it to be forgotten for all time?"
In all, Operation Gomorrah, the military name for the bombing raids on Hamburg, claimed around 34,000 lives. Barely half the victims could be identified. People now fled from the devastated city in droves, homeless, desperate and terrified. An assembly centre was set up in Hamburg's Moorweide Park. The actual aim of the bombing campaign was to break German morale, but that was something the Allies never achieved. Fireman Hans Brunswick documented the exodus of the survivors. In the days after the first massive air raid, around 900,000 people left Hamburg. They were evacuated into the hinterland on trucks. Some tried to make their way to southern Germany, where they felt they would be safer.
In May 1943, work began in Hamburg and in a film studio in Berlin on the production of one of the Third Reich's last colour films. But because of the increasing number of air raids, the shooting was moved to Prague. The aim of the entertainment film, Grand Freedom No. 7, was to take people's minds off the ever-present war. German film star Hans Albers played the main role in a love drama which took place on the Reeperbahn in Hamburg. But the censor refused to allow the film to be shown in Germany. It was thought that there were ulterior motifs behind the title. What's more, the characters did not correspond to the Nazi ideal. Consequently, it was only after the war that the film became a classic.
Ein armer Wicht, der erkennt sich nicht, mein St. Pauli, St. Pauli.
The Nazi leadership was now placing its remaining hopes of final victory in what it called its wonder weapons. In late June 1943, the first V-2 rockets were tested in absolute secrecy at the experimental centre in Peenemünde on the Baltic coast. The plan was to use the new type of missile to attack Allied cities in retaliation for the Allied bombing of German cities. For documentary purposes, all the tests were filmed, sometimes in colour. At the end of the war, the material was seized by the American Secret Service and taken back to the United States. In the early days, the test results were inconsistent. Time and again, things went wrong.
Engineer Werner von Braun had developed the new rockets and brought them up to production level. Although he was a member of the SS and used slave laborers from concentration camps in the construction of his rockets, von Braun was not put on trial by the Allies. Later, he was even allowed to head NASA's lunar program. The head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, traveled to Peenemünde to form his own impression of the V-2. Because of Allied bombing raids, production was moved to a mine in the Harz Mountains. On September the 7th, 1944, the first V-2 hit London.
With Allied bombing raids now threatening to paralyze Germany's entire armaments industry, more and more facilities vital to the war effort were being moved underground or given special protection. In 1944, for example, a huge reinforced concrete colossus was built in the Bremen suburb of Fage for the construction of submarines. A naval architect filmed the work with his camera. He was one of the few cine enthusiasts who still had 16mm colour material. Unintentionally, he also recorded the brutality of the Nazi dictatorship. The project was built with slave labour from concentration camps. Despite the efforts of tens of thousands of workers from concentration camps, the Valentin bunker was never finished, and not a single submarine was ever built in it.
The Nazi propaganda machine still had some 35mm film at its disposal, and its camera teams were instructed to produce footage at the front and at home. These pictures show German dive bombers in action somewhere in Russia. In January 1944, Joseph Goebbels had at last given his approval to the old plan of producing a monthly color newsreel for showing in neutral countries. The first of 3 editions of Panorama were screened that same year. Scenes like these from ground attack aircraft in the east were probably filmed much earlier. In the summer of 1944, cameraman Heinz von Jaworski filmed on a Sunday in Berlin in the 5th year of the war. By now, Berlin journalist Ruth Andreas Friedrich was hoping to see the end of Nazi rule. Yet, she had her doubts.
If we talk, plan or recruit followers, we will hang, because at least 1 person in 10 is treacherous or talks too much. Yet if we remain silent and are only up in arms in the silence of our own 4 walls, we keep the Nazis in power. That is the tragedy of our situation. Can a small group of 10 or 20 resolute souls topple the Third Reich? And we are only a small group. Small groups in Berlin, small groups in Dresden, in Breslau, or in Hamburg, a handful here, a handful there, who, like the king's children in the fairy tale, never come together.